I walked up to the front courtyard and I couldn't believe it. After so many years of waiting since I was a child, I'd finally arrived. I was at the Heian Shrine. Hello and welcome back to Nightingale in Japan. And in this video, I will be taking you on my journey through Kyoto, going up the mountainous Inari Shrine, which is absolutely gorgeous, and also visiting my childhood dream, the Heian Shrine. This is the second video in a 6-episode series, where in my last video, I was talking about having to travel from Australia, Brisbane, to Osaka, Japan, and the dramas that were involved in that. If you'd like to watch the last video, I will include it at the end of this video, and I'll also put it into the description. Let's jump in. It was my first day in Japan, and both my wife and I were absolutely knackered from the day before. However, we had to push on because that day we were going to the Heian Shrine, and I could not wait. I'd been waiting for this since I was a kid. So you can sleep when you're dead, right? That morning, my wife and I got ready. We took the elevator down into the hotel reception, and we walked outside the main doors, and as soon as I did, a massive blast of cold air again, which was absolutely gorgeous, especially the contrast between Australia, which was the really boiling hot heat of the East Sunshine Coast, going straight into winter. I was absolutely loving it. And as we started to walk outside into the street, straight away, the architecture was just fantastic. A lot of Kyoto keeps a lot of its old school charm, and you can see these little old school Japanese houses called Minka. When I was younger, I always had the thought, oh, maybe one day, maybe I might be able to buy a Japanese house like that. However, some of these houses, from what I've heard, can be cheap to buy, but the cost to actually renovate them is astronomical. And then the inverse of that is some are really expensive from the get-go, and just trying to maintain that level of upkeep can be quite a burden on the pocket. The first step in our journey was to go and get coffee. Every morning I love to have a nice coffee, and so my wife and I went to the local Konbini and I bought a Boss coffee. Boss coffee is a black coffee which is served in a bottle. You can either buy it warm or you can buy it cold, and I generally like my coffee cold. But it's interesting, that was my first time I tried Boss coffee, and to this day, it's been 6 months, anytime I drink Boss coffee, your nose is very connected to your memories and the nostalgia effect. Every time I drink a sip of Boss coffee, it takes me back to my first morning in Japan, which is awesome. It's one of those things. It's just when you think about having something that your mum made for you when you were a kid, you eat it and it takes you back to when your mum actually made it for you. So after I'd had my coffee, my wife and I then jumped onto a bus, and again I was absolutely wrapped. Everything, I was just taking in everything. There was so much to see, and even when I look back at some of the photos, I'm seeing things that at the time I didn't quite understand, but now I have more of an understanding. It's such an overwhelming attack on the senses when you first arrive. It's hard to say. Whilst in Australia, I had quite a culture shock when I moved there when I was 17. This was on a bit of a different level. It was just a completely different world, and the world that I can now call home, which is awesome. The bus took us to the nearest station, to the shrine. My wife and I got off the bus, and it was a bit funny because I was fumbling the money, and you know what it's like when you first arrive in a new country. Some of you may not, of course, but when you first arrive, you're trying to work out what each coin is, and you can look like a bit of a dick. But anyway, we got off the bus, and my wife was the navigator because she's native Japanese and she understood where we were going. But as we started walking towards the shrine, something caught my eye. And again, I can't put it into words. I was really shocked, but right next to us was a katana and samurai armor shop. Do you think we went in? Yes, we did. Downstairs was filled with all various different types of katanas and throwing weapons, and I was absolutely flabbergasted. We had to take our shoes off before we were allowed to go upstairs. But as you can see in this picture, 3 suits of samurai armor, and in the glass case were more katanas. And something that was very interesting to me was my first experience of tatami mats, and that is why I had to take my shoes off, which I am now very accustomed to. When I first arrived, I made more mistakes about forgetting to remove my shoes when I entered a house, but that has become somewhat second nature. Of course, I still make mistakes. And after being chuffed to bits with the experience I had in the shop, my wife and I moved on to our next destination, the Heian Shrine, or otherwise what I like to call the Tekken Shrine. My wife and I approached the front courtyard and I couldn't believe it. Since I was 7 years old and played Tekken, the first Tekken on PlayStation 1, there is a level on that game called Kyoto, and it actually features the Heian Shrine, or at least an adaptation of the Heian Shrine, as one of the backgrounds where you can fight people. And I was finally there. After all this time, I'd finally arrived in one of the places that I wanted to tick off on my bucket list. My wife and I started to walk through, and as you can imagine, I started taking as many photos as possible. But my wife soon told me off. Apparently, you're not actually meant to, one, start walking through the middle of the arches, because the kami, or the spirits, the deities, that's their path. They are the ones that go through the middle. You have to take the side path or adjacent to the middle. And also, the other thing was, we first have to pay our respects to the kami before we can start wandering around and taking in the sights of the shrine. So I learned the hard way there. It's not really, because it was an enjoyable experience. So both my wife and I went up to the altar. I'm not sure if it's called an altar, but we went up to the altar and we both put in a coin into the shrine donation box, and we were able to ring the bell. And then as soon as you rung the bell, you clap your hands together twice, once, twice, and then you pray. My wife was obviously the one that was doing the praying, because for me, I felt a bit out of place in a way, because it's not my religion as such. I'm not religious in that sense, but the experience was awesome. Once we'd done that, I was able to take as many pictures and as much footage as I want. And as you can see, it was fantastic. It was absolutely gorgeous. I would love to do like a montage one day, or a pretend Tekken montage one day in the actual Heian Shrine, but I might be a bit disrespectful doing that, so probably not. Once we'd taken in everything that we wanted to, we left the shrine. And as is what I found typical of Japan, as we were wandering back to the bus stop, we came across the Myoden-Ji temple, and it's part of the Nichiren sect. And as you can see, the sculpture of the male figure looks absolutely fantastic. Again, another hats off to the architecture there. Once we jumped back on the bus, we went back to the hotel room and we had a bit of a rest, before later that night I had my first izakaya experience, or what is called a Japanese pub. And I can't quite remember what I had that night, but knowing me at that point in time, I probably played it safe with a bit of yakitori, Japanese chicken skewers, and also probably some sort of rice. I think from memory I was quite impressed by the size of the alcoholic drinks that you could buy as well. After our meal, we went back to the hotel and quickly fell asleep because we were so tired. The next morning brought with it the expectation of a lot of walking, and so my wife and I caught the train to the Inari Shrine, which has thousands of torii gates which meander all the way up to the top of a mountain with his sort of shrine at the top. and along the path going up the mountain were lots of little statues of little kitsunes and Japanese lion dogs and even dragons. And what topped it off was some of the people who took care of the shrine actually went as far as knitting little woolen hats for the statues to put on them to keep them warm because it was winter. I thought that was really cute. As we were walking up the mountain, we were fortunate to actually cross paths with a shrine ceremony taking place. So as you can see, some of the monks and other people that are involved within that sort of ceremony are walking up the mountain. Once we reached the top of the mountain, we did some of the prayers and then we started making our way back down. And just as we made our way back down, there was a coffee shop. So I needed another top up. So I decided I'd have a coffee, and after that, my wife and I started walking down the other side of the mountain, and with it brought a complete different range of views. And this is where I managed to experience my first ume tree, so plum tree. Now, initially I thought it was a sakura tree, in other words, a cherry blossom tree, but my wife said she thinks it's an ume tree, and as you can see from the colours, it's absolutely gorgeous. After the delight of the Inari Shrine, my wife and I then moved on to the Sanjūsangen-dō temple, which unfortunately I'm not actually able to show you pictures of the inside because photography was prohibited. I will actually share a link within the description where you can have a look at some of the photography on Google. However, fortunately, I was actually able to take some pictures of the gorgeous outside, and as you can see, the gardens and the actual architecture of this place was absolutely gorgeous. Something that was really interesting to me was I could actually see one of the bells in the garden, and that instantly took me back and reminded me of an area in the Final Fantasy VII game called Wutai, and you have to actually ring one of those bells in order to open a secret door. So for me, that was very exciting. After having such a wonderful time in Kyoto, this actually concludes this portion of this video, and in the next video I will be going from Kyoto on the famous Shinkansen, or otherwise Japanese bullet train, and my next destination will be the city, which is the epicenter of Japan, or is otherwise known as Nerd Mecca, and can also be called what we all know, Tokyo City. And so if you enjoyed this video, please hit a like and a subscribe, and thank you very much for following me on my journey in Nightingale in Japan. Take care, bye.